Live from the Clarity from Chaos studios, heard worldwide, it's Dave Campbell. On every episode, Dave and his guests explore, discuss, and work on solutions to some of life's biggest challenges. So, if you're ready, be prepared to be enlightened, amused, and even shocked by what you hear. And now, the real, the authentic, the one and only Dave Campbell.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to Clarity from Chaos. I'm your host, Dave Campbell. If you're new to the show and like what you hear, please share the show with a friend. I'd really appreciate it. But before we get into this edition of Clarity, I would like to share a few thoughts. For a long time, I thought the issues in our country were political and media orchestrated. I was wrong. They're spiritual. It's as simple as good versus evil. The radicals in this country are trying to destroy it, and it's because it was founded on a Judeo-Christian idea, and they cannot stand it. We need to stop thinking in terms of Democrat-Republican as adversaries, but thinking more biblical. We need to bring the church back into our lives, and with it, the Bible. We need to defeat this threat spiritually. The people we elect need to answer to a higher authority, not the puppet masters they answer to today. So with that, I would like to share a Bible passage before we move on. This is from Proverbs 27, verse 17. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Not everyone sharpens you. Some only drain you. That's why God removes the wrong ones and replaces them with the right ones. He knows what you can't see. He hears what you don't hear. He will connect you to the voices that lift you higher. We are incredibly pleased to welcome back to Clarity the founder and president of the International Council for Men and Boys, Mr. Edward Bartlett. Ed was also a federal regulator at the Department of Health and Human Services. Welcome back, Ed.
Dave, and thank you so much for emphasizing we have to start thinking about evil and about goodness and frame these issues in those terms, not just simply as right or wrong.
Right. Yeah, to me, it's binary, Ed. It's good and it's evil. And we need to start getting back to the basics. And we need to start electing people that adhere to the basics and not just pander to what's going on. So I'll kind of leave that alone for the time being. Now, within recent news, I think it was the 60-minute interview with Dana White, to be exact, the term toxic masculinity came up. And I was sitting there scratching my head. And then when I saw your press release, we're now talking in terms of feminine toxicity. And so let's just start with that, because to me, you're looking at two ends opposing things here, and somebody's pushing an agenda somewhere.
For sure, somebody is pushing an agenda. I think we have to call out the feminists. Once again, they are trying to stereotype and vilify men. Originally, they used the word traditional masculinity in a negative sense, meaning if you were strong, if you were able to control your emotions, et cetera, that somehow this was not a good manifestation of masculinity. And then they decided, hey, let's sharpen the edge of this. We'll change it from traditional masculinity to toxic masculinity. And so that was the term they used over and over again. And finally, just in the past year, we're seeing a lot of, especially women, who are now talking about toxic femininity. So,
right.
So the whole discussion has gone full circle.
Yeah, and the interesting part, Ed, is they're not talking about the other half of this, right? That there's a lot of women out there that are now starting to react to the toxic behaviors of females. And that is getting no press, none whatsoever. I dare you to dial into The View and hear about toxicity among females. You won't hear it, right? You know, they spent the entire week talking about Dana White and, you know, the MMA fighting and how horrible that was from a masculine standpoint, but they didn't go over the 5 or 6 points that define the dangerous, toxic femininity that's really out there.
Yeah. So, it's not uncommon these days to hear women brag, not just admit, brag that they participate in OnlyFans, which of course is basically a prostitution striptease online program. And I don't know the exact number. We're talking about millions of women internationally are making a lot of money, I should add, participating in OnlyFans. But it's not just that. Just a couple of days ago, I saw some young women were at a party somewhere, and they were openly bragging that, yeah, I'm a hoe, and yeah, my body count is over 100. What I mean, you have to say this is this is a complete reversal of sort of the key uh, precepts and beliefs of our society. And yes, so that these are just I could give other examples of what people are now calling toxic femininity.
Right. Yeah, I think part of your press release goes into acting helpless over unpleasant tasks, blaming their misbehavior on their monthly period, for God's sake, coercing a man into sex, which you basically just touched on, threatening to harm yourself over a breakup, being
Right, right.
physically abusive, which is completely underreported. And then the big one, lying about birth control. Because, you
Yes.
know, you know, this is one right here that I've got personal experience in two different areas that the men were basically shuttled into the corner because they were just sperm donors. And, when I saw that lying about birth control, I went, whoa, here we go. You know, this
Right,
isn't being talked about at all.
right, right. And I'll tell you a story. Just a few years ago, the Nebraska legislature was actually considering a bill that would criminalize, now get this, would criminalize men who remove a condom shortly before having sex. In other words, there's that element of deception, but that would be classified as rape. So I literally spent the whole day in the Nebraska legislature going door to door and saying, well, hey, you all need to be aware that this is actually far more common behavior by women who are supposedly on birth control pills and stop taking those birth control pills and never tell
Purposely. Yeah.
their husband or boyfriend. And that's exactly the same issue. Well, when I made that point very clear, and that was according to the Centers for Disease Control, so I wasn't making up these numbers. I basically obliterated that bill in a single day just because people saw the idiocy of that concept.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, Ed. Here you have a bunch of political individuals chasing down and constructing a bill when they haven't even thought through it. They haven't even considered, the ramifications of what they're trying to do. They're just reacting to somebody yanking their chain, if you will. I'm sorry. I mean, we're in the middle right now of a government shutdown, with is basically ridiculous. Just the whole concept of it is ridiculous, and it just continues to go on and on.
Right, right. So let's go back to this toxic femininity issue
Yeah,
because
right.
there's a leading women's magazine called Evie, Evie, and actually become a fan of Evie just because they're willing to print articles that are sort of outside of the feminist narrative. And it was in August that Evie magazine published an editorial called, quote, "Can we talk about toxic femininity yet?" End quote. And in that article, and this is not written by a journalist, this is by the editors of the magazine, meaning it represented the thinking of the top people at that magazine. And they wrote negative feminine traits typically include emotional manipulation, passive aggressiveness, and the weaponization of gossip. What do you think of that?
Man, that's funny that they would put that in print. Yeah, again, none of this seems to be passing muster with any of the major news outlets or anything else. You know, that there the agenda is still, pushing this whole female platform idea. And another thing that I saw it, that you reference is the rejection of Marxist notions on gender equality.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. So, first
Yeah.
of all, let's understand that feminism emerged from and originated in Marxist ideology. You can go all the way back to Karl Marx in the 1830s, 18 said that the family is, quote, oppressive to women. Okay. So, and you look at, some of the Marxist and Soviet leaders, they were strong advocates for feminism, and they were talking about. I mean, you've heard of in the Soviet Union, they had these communes where the women were sent out in the fields to work, and the kids went to a commune child care center. That is truly the feminist ideal right there. Okay, so when feminists talk about their vision about the future, first of all, they've created this artificial construct called patriarchy, right? Well, I'm here to tell you there is no such thing as patriarchy. The reality is that men are lagging behind women in 12 different areas, not just in the US. Globally, men are dying 5 years earlier than women. Fewer men are enrolled in colleges, homelessness, severe treatment by the legal system. I could go on and on with that list. So if there truly was a patriarchy, you have to say these patriarchs are doing a pretty awful job upholding the rights and the welfare of men, because it is truly the welfare of men that's lagging around the world.
Right. Yeah, they're going down the porcelain chute and have been for years. You can't even turn on the television anymore without some dad being ridiculed for being a father. I mean, it's commonplace, and they
Right.
continue to drive it home. It's quite frankly, it's pretty disgusting. So, with the whole feminist movement being part of the Marxist ideology, then that pretty much explains the whole new Democrat platform and the U.S. recent big push towards socialism.
Well, I have to agree with you. Marxists realized in the early part of this century that this whole theory of the underclass was going to rise up and overthrow their capitalist oppressors, that theory was not working. In fact, the workers of the world were doing reasonably well. They had unionized, they had good wages, they had worker protection laws, and by George, workers were pretty happy with their situation in life. So the Marxists said, "Well, we're going to have to get rid of that class focus of Marxism. We're going to focus on this gender issue, the gender aspects of Marxism." So that is, I think it's fair to say that focus on gender has largely replaced the traditional Marxist focus on class consciousness.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Let's shift gears then and talk about the UN studies that have come out recently. And maybe you could go over some of that stuff because I found it quite fascinating. And again, it's not being picked up by anybody and discussed anywhere except here and through your organization and others like yours.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. So yeah, I've really done a deep dive into the United Nations. I've actually had meetings with about 20 missions in New York City. When I say missions, these are country missions like Samoa and Portugal and so forth, and talked to ambassadors and gotten a good insight into what's going on. So before the 2010, I think it's fair to say that the United Nations was generally sympathetic to feminist goals and ideals, just because that was sort of the predominant narrative. So, for example, here's just one example. The World Health Organization did an international survey on domestic violence, but they somehow believe that women are never violent. So they only ask people about male on female violence, never the opposite. That was just one example of many examples I could give you of bias. What happened in the year 2010 was a new agency was added to the United Nations, UN Women. UN Women. And UN Women, in theory, was supposed to work for gender equality and women's empowerment. But again, if it's true that men are lagging in 12 areas behind women, like the ones I mentioned, and other areas, if they're sincere about gender equality, they should have devoted at least equal attention to rectifying the areas of disparity affecting men, getting them to live longer, stopping the suicide problem, on and on. But in reality, no, they did not do that one bit. In fact, what I have seen is that the impact of UN Women has been to actually worsen the situation. UN Women has so much money, they get so much resources from various countries, they are able to give like subgrants to other UN agencies like the Human Rights Council or UNICEF. Those are just two examples. And those grants come with sort of an implicit promise, oh, that they will only focus on women's issues and ignore the men's issues. So you look across the entirety of the United Nations, with just a few exceptions of the World Health Organization, the United Nations has become beholden to feminist ideology. Let me say that again because I think it's so important. The UN has become beholden to feminist ideology.
Well, I think Guterres basically panders to all of that as well, doesn't he?
Who are you referring to?
Yeah, the UN General Assembly, or the president of the UN. I think it's Guterres.
Yeah, Antonio Guterres.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point. Most people are not aware. Guterres, who's from Portugal, was the former president of the International Socialist Alliance. Doesn't that say a little bit about his
yeah,
political leanings?
yeah.
Okay, so when Guterres stands up in March, every March they have what's called the Status of Women Conference in New York City. We were there just because we wanted to sort of rain on their parade a little bit, but he actually gave a talk to the whole group. He talked about the poison of patriarchy. Now, first of all, again, there's no such thing as patriarchy. So for him to say this, use this word publicly and vilify it by saying the poison of patriarchy is is beyond acceptability.
Well, that's amazing that you literally have to take a step back from that.
You do. Yes. Yeah, it is shocking. And other UN leaders have also used this term patriarchy as if it was a real thing. Part of this, Dave, is being driven by what's called the Strategic Development Goals, SDGs, Strategic Development Goals. So they have like 24 different areas like economic development and environment and, of course, gender equality.
Sounds almost like George Soros's Open Society, Ed.
Yeah, right. It and they started this back, I think, in about 10 years ago, and they are now seeing that the progress on gender equality is so slow and even regressing in some areas that they are now realizing they are not going to reach their SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals for gender equality by the year 2030, which is 5 years from now. They're not going to reach those goals. They are truly freaking out. They are freaking out with a realization they are not going to achieve these. I mean, they were unattainable in the first place. So it's kind of it's both sad and it's also hilarious to see the people having this freak out over these.
Well, that brings up a thought that I just had, and every once in a while I do have them. The rise of gangs globally. I wonder how that ties to the whole feminist movement because the gangs are basically a substitute for the lack of a man in the child's life, right? So I'm just wondering the correlation between this push by the feminists and how it might relate to the rise of these gangs globally. The Trans de Agua, the MS-13, all the rest of them from these different countries, and of course here domestically. I just wonder about the connection, if there is one.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there is a logical connection there that the breakdown of the family immediately translates into the marginalization of the father, and that in turn leads to a lack of positive role models for kids. So yeah, they gravitate to gangs, and gangs typically are not doing things that are good for societies. I think there's a correlation. I don't know that anybody has studied it scientifically,
Yeah,
but it certainly
probably
makes
not.
sense to me.
But yeah, I think, it just, from a layperson's standpoint, if I just look at it, there's the transition from boyhood to manhood, and that transition doesn't take place without a father. So therefore it's represented by the gangs, and you constantly hear about the rite of passage that these gang members go through. And to me, logically, that rite of passage would have happened in the household, in the family, as opposed to the way it presents itself today.
Right. Yeah. That certainly makes sense to me, and I certainly agree with the logic. But what you really put your finger on is that the marginalization of fathers have a panoply of harmful effects on society. And it starts with kids themselves not having a good role model, so they look in the wrong places. You see higher school dropout rates, you see higher teenage pregnancy rates, you see higher criminal activity rate. I mean, across a broad range of social indicators, you see not just a 1 or 2% difference. You see massive differences in terms of these social indicators for fatherless versus father kids with fathers. It's really a stunning difference. And you look at these numbers and say, who in their right mind would say that we shouldn't be doing everything in our power to restore fathers to our families? But the fact that feminists, this is the feminist line. They say, well, but if you do that, you're going to increase child abuse. Well, I have news for you. Guess who are the primary perpetrators of child abuse in the United States? Any guesses? Mother.
Yep,
Mothers are
absolutely.
the primary.
Actually, Ed, I hate to say this. I saw something on X yesterday with a woman kicking a child because the child was making noise during a party that she was having.
You know
They
about the child in the back who was standing on the
Yes,
bed? I saw
yes,
that too.
yes.
Yes,
That's and that typifies what you just said, right? That absolutely typifies, and I don't know, if the audience saw that or not, but I was so angered when I saw that something that like that would happen, and that I didn't see somewhere that she was being drug out the door in handcuffs for child abuse. Even more angered me. Uh,
right, right.
so
So the Department of Health and Human Services, where I used to work, they actually have a division or a unit that looks at child welfare, and they actually every year they publish a report on child maltreatment. And you can look in there, they publish it every year, and there's a section called perpetrators. Well, every year I've actually gone back numerous years. Every year it's the mother who is far more likely to be a perpetrator of child abuse than the father. So when feminists try to block father involvement by saying, well, that'll increase child abuse, hey, they're telling a lie.
yeah, well, yeah, and that seems to be the flavor of the day anyway, right? Is everybody lying about something. Nobody really wants to be saddled with the truth, Ed. And quite frankly, that goes back to what I said at the beginning. It's unfortunate, but you know, we need to start dealing in the truth and not a bunch of
Right.
kabuki theater stuff that continues to go on.
Right. Well, at the risk of overemphasizing how harmful feminism is, the point you're raising is directly attributable to feminist ideology, and it's called feminist scholarship. All right. You can look up on Google if you want to look up for the words feminist scholarship, and you'll see feminists openly saying, yes, the whole point of feminist scholarship is to diminish objectivity and to increase the feminist worldview and ideology into science. They openly say that. They're not embarrassed to come out. So, when you see these gross misrepresentations, these one-sided portrayals, that just didn't happen by accident. This is the
It's
working of feminist
right.
scholarship.
Yeah, no, this is everything that we've been talking about tonight is purposeful. It didn't just pop up, in the garden. You know,
Yes,
people.
that's the key point. Yes.
There's an absolute, with this issue and many 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 other issues. It is absolutely purposeful that what is being done um, to degrade the family and everything else. So let's shift gears just a teeny bit and talk about the Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance. Let's talk about the work that they're doing.
Yeah. So the we affectionately refer to it as DAVIA, Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance. The website is end2dv.org/DAVIA. And so we found, and this goes back, actually, we're celebrating our 4th-year anniversary this week. We just got tired of all of the lies, feminist lies, saying that domestic violence is only a problem perpetrated by men on women. We got tired of that. We said, okay, we're going to pull together a group of organizations from various countries who are willing to counter this lie, because this lie is now embedded in legislation. It's embedded in sort of the cultural narrative, on and on. So we just sort of, again, this was 4 years ago, and we got just in the first month, we got, I think, 10 or 15 organizations in Australia and the UK and different places. And so we decided to, hey, what are we going to call this? Okay, we'll call it the Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance. And so we just kind of created a website, and lo and behold, it began to grow organically. We are now up to 206 organizational members in 41 countries around the world.
Wow.
Our most recent member came from Brazil, a group dealing with false allegations of domestic violence. So this has just sort of emerged of its own will, and so Davi has monthly calls for the members and puts out press releases to expose the latest mischief of the United Nations.
Yeah, man. Yeah, and again, the website is endtodv.org/Davia, DAVIA, right?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's certainly something that needs to be out there, because the amount of manure that continues to be spread about this topic is just amazing. And again, it goes back to, Ed, what I said was, it's purposeful. I mean, you literally can't make this crap up, right? You literally can't.
That's a
Because I
great
think,
point.
you
Yeah,
know, I think a lot of women, in the flyover country would rather be stay-at-home moms, help raise what I would consider do the most important job that there is, and that's raising functional human beings, right? And as opposed to this mumbo jumbo that we continue to hear and bombarded with on a daily basis from the corporate news and everything else. It's, quite frankly, it's shameful what they're doing and the long-term effect of what they've done to the family. It's just unconscionable of what they've done.
yeah. It's hard to come up with words that are too strong to describe this harmful negative effects. And if I can just draw back to the United Nations, so part of the sustainable development goals is to have equal numbers of male and female national lawmakers. All right. Right now, the number is, if you just look at national lawmakers, like in the Congress and so forth, 27% internationally of national lawmakers are female. Well, the women at UN women are appalled, absolutely appalled that it's only 27%. They want it to be 50%. That's their notion. That's a Marxist definition. It's not equal opportunity. It's identical outcomes. And that's a good example of the difference of Marxist ideology.
Yep, absolutely. The website for the International Council of Men and Boys is www.menandboys.net, correct?
That's right. Yes.
Well, it's great work that you're doing. I'm sure it seems thankless with trying to climb Mount Everest, with being only clad in Bermuda shorts and sneakers, but It is absolutely an essential thing to try to wrest control back to some form of normalcy for us as a society. And I think you're doing great work, and I really appreciate your time spending with us and going through some of this stuff, because I know the people that are listening to this podcast are completely unaware to a large extent of what you've talked about, because they just don't hear it. They don't hear it anywhere. So
Yeah.
again,
Well,
it's
everything I say is science based and factual. Go to our website, you'll see the information. The fact that women are just as likely to engage in domestic violence as men. That comes straight from the Centers for Disease Control. Actually, the actual numbers show more female perpetrators than male, but I wanted to be sort of even-handed, so I didn't get into the nuances there. But again, everything that I've said is science based and factual, and we have to regain control of our society, and do that by changing the narrative.
no, and we can't continue to allow them to get away with the BS that they seem to get away with. So we've been talking to Mr. Edward Bartlett, who's the president and founder of the International Council for Men and Boys. And I encourage you to go out to his website. And again, the website is www.menandboys.net, and go out and get the information you need to the next time you're at a cocktail party, you can actually drop the hammer on somebody with some facts and become persona non grata to your friends and neighbors. So anyway, Ed, it's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
Same for me. Great to chat with you again, Dave.
Okay, take care, sir.
Be in touch.
All
Bye-bye.
right.
Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to more Clarity from Chaos shows on demand, go to clarityfromchaos.buzzsprout.com or send Dave an email at info@clarityfromchaos.com for information on previous shows. You can also listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Twitter, or Google Podcast. Until next time, please remember, it's not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Be well, everyone.